So in the interest of time, because I know the last time with the webinar we got going, we ended up going over 2 hours. I am going to get started even as a few more people sign up, doing my intro and that kind of stuff. It'll take me a few minutes to go through that, and then we'll get Brian on the air as soon as possible. And so, excellent, Janice, I hear you. Janice, you're from California and did everything perfectly on the technology side, even though it sounds like you didn't know what you were doing, but you did it great. So congratulations, Janice. So excellent, excellent. So everybody, it's 2 p.m., so we're going to kick this right off. This is Stacy from the Community Cats podcast, and welcome to the Return to Field webinar presented by Neighborhood Cats. Everybody is being entered in the mute format. The webinar is being recorded, and you'll have access to the recording within 24 hours of the presentation. It will also be posted to YouTube in about a week or two. And if you have questions, feel free to put it in the question box in the control panel. Please note that we're expecting a large group today, so we're going to do our best to respond to questions, as many of the questions as possible. Susie and myself and Kristen will be watching the questions. Please let us know if you can't hear me talking. Kristen or I will assist you, but it seems like everybody is in great shape. And then all the questions are also going to be recorded, and we'll be able to see them afterwards if for some reason we weren't able to get to a question during the presentation today. So everybody's been doing a great job listing their name and the group that they're from. And also for those that just sign up, just a reminder that the handouts down in the handouts section of your control panel is a PDF of the slides. So you can download that at this point in time. If for some reason you happen to forget to do this, you can always email me later and I will send you the PDF of the slides. But just to let you know, the slides are in there if you want to do that. For folks that don't know about the Community Cats podcast, it's a podcast that has now done over 300 episodes, and we run the annual online cat conference, which is going to be January 24th to 26th. We also run a newly launched online kitten conference, which is going to be June 14th through 16th, 2020, partnering with the National Kitten Coalition. And we've also assisted with over 100 groups to help funding community cat spay neuter via Community Cats Grants program. And if you are interested in finding out more about the Community Cats podcast, feel free to go to the communitycatspodcast.com, or also if you're interested in the online cat conference, please go to the online www.onlinecatconference.com. I'd also like to especially thank my technical cat, Kristen Petrie, for helping make these webinars happen. And then just, I'm so happy and thankful for everybody who's turned up today for the presentation. So Return to Field is an incredibly popular program for saving the lives of community cats. What is it exactly, and why are shelters around the country embracing it? Neighborhood Cats, a proactive participant in 2 Return to Field programs and co-author of the new Return-to-Field Handbook published by HSUS, will take a deep dive into the policies and issues surrounding this still controversial approach. Brian will look at how to run an RTF program, including ways that local groups and volunteers can contribute, plus how to integrate RTF with TNR to achieve the biggest possible impact. As I mentioned earlier, please save the date for our next webinar, which will be March 14th, 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and we will be focusing again on trappers' tips and tricks. And now I'd like to introduce and also thank both Brian Cordes and Susie Richmond. Brian is the co-founder and National Programs Director for Neighborhood Cats, a leading community cat advocacy group with hands-on programs in New York City, New Jersey, and Maui. Currently, he and his wife, Susan Richmond, live in Hawaii and can usually be found trapping cats or releasing them after they've been neutered. In between stints with Neighborhood Cats, he served as grants manager for PetSmart Charities, overseeing over $21 million in TNR and spay-neuter projects. He has produced many of the leading educational materials on trap-neuter return, including award-winning books and videos. He's assisted numerous communities in setting up large-scale TNR programs and is a frequent presenter on community cat issues. Brian has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Cornell University and a JD from the University of California in Berkeley. Susan Richmond is the Executive Director of Neighborhood Cats. She joined the organization after over 20 years running a major New York City shelter and nonprofit veterinary clinic. At Neighborhood Cats, she's led multiple large targeted TNR projects in New York City and Northern New Jersey, managed a program for providing scholarships to veterinarians for training in high-volume spay-neuter of community cats, and co-authored the Humane Society of the United States online course on TNR. In her spare time, she can often be found trapping feral cats in Maui. I'd also like to do a quick shout out for Tomahawk Traps, and they've been an ongoing sponsor of the webinar series this year, and they did extend a 10% off your order discount code for those that have attended the webinars this year. That code is DCNC19. That's DCNC19 if you'd like to get 10% off your next order at Tomahawk's Traps. So Brian, are you out there? Is your mic on? Brian, Brian will unmute you. Brian, can you unmute yourself?
Yep, here I am.
There you are. Excellent, excellent. All right, excellent. He was too busy writing down his discount code for Tomahawk Traps.
There you go.
So anyway, so Brian, at this point in time, I would like to share my screen with share the screen with you.
Okay.
So let me do that. And here we go. And that should come up pretty soon. And then we will let you launch.
Okay, just let me know when you can see me.
I can see you. Yep, excellent. Great.
Okay, all right, great. Thank you, Stacy. And welcome everybody. Thanks for taking time out today. I wanted to start off with just getting some sense of where people are with return to field in their own communities. So we're actually going to start off with a very quick poll. Kristen, can you run that one?
Actually, I'm happy to launch that. I
could,
share.
Okay.
There she goes. She's got it.
Okay, so basically, we're just trying to find out, do you have a return to field program? Are you about to start one? Is there nothing going on?
Yep. Okay. So you want me to close? Tell me when you want the poll to close.
Oh, in another 15 seconds. Yeah.
We have 70% voted. 73, 75, 77, 79.
Oh, as long as it's going up.
All right, I think I'm going to close the poll and share the results. See where the results went. There they go. So the results are 50% said yes, 26% said no, 3% said not yet but soon, and 21% said I'm not sure.
Okay, well that's great. Having 50%, over 50% either having a program or about to have one is pretty impressive. It shows you how much this program is starting to spread. So let's get into it. And as Stacy said, myself and Susan Richmond, our executive director, are co-presenting. I'm the live voice you'll hear, and Susie and Stacy will be typing away. One point I just want to make is that when we create presentations like this, or we write handbooks or things like that, it comes from firsthand experience. We're out there doing it, and that kind of gives us a unique insight into how things work and what problems there are to continue to solve. There, as Stacy mentioned, there is a Return to Field Handbook that's now out there, and this is very much a how-to. You can get a free download or get a print copy for purchase at animalsheltering.org/return-to-field. And this was written by Danielle Bays of the Humane Society of the United States, myself, Susie and Karen Little from Alley Cat Advocates. And the first chapter goes over a lot of the policy behind Return to Field, but the vast majority of the book is kind of the nuts and bolts. What we realized was that this program is spreading very quickly around the country. But what we saw was that every time a shelter started this, they were having to figure it out themselves about how to actually implement it. So we wanted to begin to build a kind of common pool of knowledge, and that's what this handbook is about. So if you're have a program now, or you're about to start one and you're wondering how to work out some of the processes, this is a good book to have a look at. So first, I just want to make sure we're all talking about the same thing, because we're going to refer to community cats a lot today. And this is what we mean when we talk about community cats. So we're talking about a cat that's free roaming, that's unowned in the sense of it's not a traditional pet. And so the definition of ownership, of course, is a little bit fluid, but we're talking about, not your typical pet cat that spends most of his time inside your house and gets regular veterinary care and all the things that come with a cat being a pet. It's important to realize, though, that community cats can their socialization can range from one end of the spectrum of being quite feral to the other end of the spectrum, which is being quite friendly. So sometimes there's this notion that community cats are feral, but what we've learned through experience is that you get the whole range of cats in terms of socialization when you talk about free roaming and unowned. And often, I would say most, the vast majority of the time, these cats are part of what we would call a colony. And we define that as a group of community cats who share a common food source and territory. Theoretically, you could have a colony of one. There's only one cat at a food source and in a territory. But in our experience, most often, these cats are in groups of, 2 or more. So what is Return to Field? This is a real simple schematic just to give you the basic idea of it. So we start off with a community cat on Main Street, and somebody traps that cat. Usually we're talking about a private citizen. It could be any number of reasons why that cat was trapped. Could be because somebody considered the cat a nuisance, somebody thought the cat needed help, somebody was feeding cats, but now all of a sudden there's too many and they don't know what to do. So they trap the cat. They bring the cat to the local open admission shelter. So traditionally, if there was no room at the shelter, or if this cat's temperament was such that they were not adoptable, or at least they presented as an unadoptable cat, that traditionally is the end of the line, and euthanasia has been the outcome for these kitties. But with Return to Field, instead of going to euthanasia, an evaluation is made about, well, just how was that cat doing out on Main Street? Did he come in healthy, which would imply that he's got a food source and adequate shelter, even if we are unable to identify exactly where that food source is or who that caretaker is? Is it likely this cat is going to continue to thrive and do well outdoors? And all these factors, and why did the person bring the cat in? All these things are evaluated. And if it's determined that there's a very good chance the cat will do just fine if he's returned back to where he was found, then that's what's done. The kitty is spayed and neutered, if not already altered, and usually they're not. Vaccinated as appropriate, given a day or so to recover, and ear tipped, of course, and then driven right back to Main Street and released back into his familiar territory. So that's what Return to Field is. Now let's talk about, first, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this, we're going to talk about the why of it. Why are more and more shelters adopting this program? So where Return to Field got started, I think it's got such a short history that we can actually talk about it. And it's kind of interesting to see where it came from. So it started on a large scale. I'm sure that shelters for many years in the past have kind of informally done this with a cat here or there, or quietly done this. But the first really major large scale government supported Return to Field program started in 2008 and in Jacksonville, Florida. And what happened was the director of the local high volume spay neuter clinic, Rick Descharme, he met with the director of the county shelter, Jacksonville Animal Care and Protective Services, and he was looking for ways to get the county involved in TNR and to be supportive. So he went to the director and he asked, is it okay, can you let us know when ear-tipped cats come into the shelter so we could try to return them to their colonies, and in that way build support for people wanting to do TNR. So the director of the agency, who actually did not have an animal welfare background, he was an interim director who had an engineering, that was his expertise, was engineering. He thought about it for a couple of days and he came back to Rick and he said, I'll tell you what, you can have all the community cats, whether they're ear-tipped or not, and fix them and put them back where they came from. So, that was, he was a bit taken aback, but up for the challenge. Got a nice grant from Best Friends Animal Society and went at it. And here are the results, which are quite impressive. So 2008, the program actually started in August of 2008. So 2007 would be the baseline year. And you can see in 2007, the blue is intake and the red is euthanasia. They were euthanizing approximately 11,500 out of over 13,000 cats. So lots of cats coming in, and 80 to 90% of them being euthanized. 2008, you can see the Return to Field started, euthanasia came down, really kicked into full gear in 2009, and the green are the number of Return to Field cats. And you can see how over the next several years, the red bar, euthanasia, just dramatically dropped. And we ended up going from over 11,000 cats euthanized to, in 2014, something like 500. So like a 90-95% decline. Another thing you see is intake dropping. We'll talk about that a little later. That is not something you can attribute directly to Return to Field, but Return to Field has an influence, because once the lead shelter in the community starts to teach the community that sterilization is the right approach, not dropping the cat off at the shelter, you often see a significant increase in TNR activity, which is what you saw in Jacksonville. They went from maybe 500 TNR surgeries countywide in 2007 to within a few years, they were over 11,000. So, and they started doing targeting, which we'll talk about too. So their intake also started coming down. Another thing that I think is a mark of a successful Return to Field program is how you see the green bar dropping gradually over time. So as this program takes effect, what we like to see are fewer and fewer cats needing to be returned to field. So why stop euthanizing? And the reason for that is, in a nutshell, because it doesn't work. Whatever your goals are in terms of community cats, you're not really, we don't see the needle changing in these high euthanasia communities. So certainly we don't see euthanasia rates going down. We don't see intake dropping, which would indicate that, we're not seeing fewer cats in the community. We don't see complaint calls going down. Since the population of community cats is not dropping, the wildlife predation is not dropping either. And as I say, we're not seeing any evidence of the number of community cats going down. So you're basically treading water. when you're relying on a high euthanasia approach. And it's like I recall one community where they were resistant and were just euthanizing year after year. And when I asked the director how that was working for her, she said, well, it's working great because we have the same number of cats coming in every year. And I had to point out to her that that was the sign of a failed policy, not a successful one, because if you were impacting the population of cats in terms of numbers, you would expect to see intake dropping, not staying the same. It basically meant that the euthanizing they were doing was not having any effect on the community at all. Now, on the other hand, even though there are few, if any, benefits to a euthanasia policy, you do incur quite a few costs. One of the ones that we don't talk about enough, but I think it's important, is it's highly, highly stressful for the people in the shelter, and especially the ones who are directly involved in doing the euthanasia procedures. And there's any number of research studies now that show that shelter workers who are directly involved in euthanasia procedures suffer from much higher incidence of mental illness. This includes sleep deprivation, post-traumatic stress disorder, even suicide. This could also explain why typically high euthanasia shelters have very high turnover. Fairly or unfairly, high euthanasia shelters tend to have poor public relations and less support in the community. This leads to less donations, fewer adoptions. So pursuing a policy that is not really improving the situation with cats does come at a very high cost. So this is why in the last decade, there's been a search for alternatives, and Return-to-Field has emerged as potentially, that another outcome that is potentially more beneficial. Why does lethal control fail? There's some, very basic reasons. One is that in most communities, there are just way too many cats and too few animal control resources. I know where we work hands-on in Maui and in New York City, the notion of the animal control officers, even if they wanted to, and nobody does, but even if they wanted to go out there and try to catch all the cats and simply eradicate the cat population, it'd be like emptying the ocean with a teacup. There's way too many of them. And there's, any other number of demands on animal control resources, dangerous dogs or abusive horses or whatever it might be, that require a lot more time and attention to kind of futilely going around and trying to trap cats, which is why you see more and more animal control agencies basically washing their hands of they don't go out and trap cats, they don't go out and offer pickup services. They have found that it's just not a good use of their time. Also, you have caretaker resistance. These community cats usually have some person attached to them in one form or another, usually as a feeder. They're not going to cooperate most of the time if they know that the outcome for these cats is death. So they're not going to tell you how many cats there are. They're not going to cooperate with withholding food. So you're basically, shooting in the dark if you're trying to catch community cats. Those of you who do a lot of TNR know that if you don't have the cooperation of the feeders, it makes trapping the cats extremely difficult, even when you're trying to help them. You have the vacuum effect, which is basically the notion that the cats are in a specific area because there are resources there to support them. There's enough food, there's adequate shelter, otherwise they wouldn't be there. If you take the cats away and those resources remain behind, you've created a vacuum that usually some new cats fill very quickly. They start to reproduce and repopulate the area. And it's rare in animal control efforts that all the cats in a colony are captured, often because nobody knows how many are there, or it just takes too much time, whatever it might be. And so the cats that are left behind now have all the resources available to them that they had to share with the cats that were taken away. And more of them, they reproduce, more of the kittens survive, and before long, you're right back where you started from. And then you have all these factors working in combination. So these, just a quick sketch of why lethal control has typically failed. So with return to field, the big question becomes, and I ask this, humorously, but because I know it's foremost on people's minds, isn't everybody going to freak out, right? All of a sudden you're like, these cats were going into the shelter, they weren't coming back, the people who brought them in don't want them there for whatever reason, and you're gonna start putting them right back on the block where they came from. Isn't everybody gonna get incredibly upset and come down hard on the shelter, and you're gonna, have untold grief to have to deal with? So I think it's really important to understand where that fear comes from. And basically, if you're sitting in a shelter, or you're at town hall, or you're an animal control dispatcher and who's taking in calls from the public, when it comes to cats, who are the people who are calling you, right? It's the people who have a problem with the cats. It's the people who don't want them there, who are complaining about them, and or who have some issue where they want them taken away. And that's going to be 99% of what you hear. So you're probably going to have the impression that the public doesn't like the cats. And if you're going to start putting them back, it's going to cause, pitchforks and torches marching on your agency. But it's important to understand that that's very much a distortion, because if people like having the cats there, like for example, the people who are feeding the cats, are they calling you? Are they ringing up 311 and saying, oh, I just wanted to let you know, thank you so much for leaving the cats there. I really enjoy seeing them every day. My kids like to play with them. They come up to me at noon for a treat every day, and it really adds to the quality of my life. We don't have any rats on the block since these cats have been. No, they don't. You never hear from them. So in order to get behind that possible distorted perception that you get when all you're hearing are complaints, groups have been conducting polls in order to find out what the public really thinks. So the first one that we know of was, and it's important to understand, these surveys were commissioned by groups you might consider biased in favor of the cats, but they were performed by neutral polling agencies. Like this one, I believe, was done by Harris Interactive. So these are all legitimate polls that were paid for by animal groups. So in this 2007 survey, this was the question. If you saw a stray cat in your community and you had to choose between leaving the cat where it is outside or having the cat caught and euthanized, which would you consider to be more humane? 3 choices: leave the cat where it is, have the cat put down, don't know, refuse to answer. So much to people's surprise, 81% of the respondents in this nationally representative survey wanted the cat left where it is. Only 14% wanted the cat euthanized. So this is very strongly suggestive that most of the community prefers a live outcome and would rather the cat lived than died. 2014, Best Friends Animal Society commissioned a similar survey, but they added a third option, which was basically A is TNR, B would be euthanasia, and C would be do nothing, just leave the stray cats alone to fend for themselves. And again, we see results that strongly suggest that most of the public wants a live outcome. So 68% thought that, so 7 out of 10 basically preferred TNR. Only a quarter of respondents thought that euthanasia was the preferable outcome. So you've got 68% to 24, almost triple the number of respondents preferred TNR. And interestingly, 8% just said leave the cats alone. But still, that would be a live outcome. So if you look at live outcomes, you're looking at 76% for live outcomes, 24% for euthanasia. There was not a survey, it was a survey, not a similar multiple choice, but this was research done by a professor in Ohio in 2008. And there's a wealth of data in there for those of you who are interested in this kind of research. But the highlights for our purposes are that 43%, we're talking about Ohio adults, 18 or over, almost half saw free roaming cats in their neighborhoods on a daily or weekly basis. 26% had actually fed. So you've got a quarter of the adult population in Ohio, according to this survey, had actually fed free roaming cats. So that's, again, shows you how strong the support for them is. Interestingly, of those that fed, only a quarter of them had ever brought a free roaming cat to a veterinarian. So that sort of points to where the real problems are when we're dealing with community cats, which is getting people who feed. If we have over a quarter of the public feeding cats, but basically only 6 to 7% getting them fixed, that's where we have a problem. But if we're trying to eradicate them and through euthanasia, well, you're going up against all those people who are out there feeding them and don't want them gone. So basically, the reality is that return to field is much more aligned with the majority who favor live outcomes and are willing to leave community cats in the environment. Euthanasia is the minority who complain about the cats and want them removed. Now they're the squeaky wheel, right, that gets the grease. But what these surveys show us is that they are not the majority. And for the shelter, the decision becomes which part of this community are you going to serve? Are you going to serve the silent majority, or are you going to continue to serve those people who are complaining and trapping the cats and bringing them to you? And if you're not seeing any benefits from them, and we talk about like the lack of public support and the fact people don't come to adopt and they don't give as much money, fundraising is more difficult in a high euthanasia environment. Well, this is why. This is why, because most people don't like euthanasia as the result. They would rather that the cats were left where they are. And what we need to do is educate them to get them fixed. And when you're doing return to field, you're leading by example. So here, what are the common fears? Besides that fear that, which I would say to date has never, that fear that, the public is going to storm the shelter and be so outraged that, your programs are going to be threatened overall, that in all the return to field programs that have, and as I say, they're growing in popularity, that has not happened. So what are some of the other fears that typically directors, shelters, managers have when they're considering doing return to field? So number one fear is that people are going to harm the cats. Okay, they brought them in. This is the stereotype is somebody hates having the cat in their backyard, so they trap the cat. They bring the cat in. You put the cat back. Now they're going to say, all right, the shelter's not an option for me. I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to harm the cat. I'm going to kill the cat. And you're going to have this exponential rise in animal abuse in your community. So the fact is that there isn't a single program yet that has reported any discernible increase in abuse once they started a return to field program. In Jacksonville, they microchipped the first 6,000 cats that went through the program in order to see if they could gather some data that might prove or disprove this fear. Were they seeing a lot more dead cats on the road? Were they seeing cases of abuse that could be traced back to these return to field cats? And basically they saw nothing, and they discontinued that part of the program. I know here in Maui, all the return to field cats are being microchipped, and we're a couple of years down the road, and there has been no evidence of these cats are subject to abuse to any greater extent than is the case with any population of unowned and stray animals. So, and part of realizing why that doesn't happen is also understanding that people bring community cats to a shelter for a variety of reasons. It's not just because they think they are nuisances. We'll talk more about that, but they're having been a participant, for a while now in 2 return to field programs, every reason under the sun why people bring community cats in. They may not know what a community cat is. They see a cat on the street and they just think, oh, this cat should be in a shelter. This cat should be in a home. Like I say, they may think they see a cat is sick and they can't afford veterinary care, so they bring the cat to the shelter. There may be behavioral issues even with outdoor cats. There's every variety of reasons besides I hate the cat. That's the stereotype. Now, there are people out there like that, but how many of those people are going to basically commit a violent crime because the cat's back in their area? That would be somebody who is pretty extremely off the wagon. And there aren't that many people like that, fortunately. We will talk about evaluating the circumstances for the cat. And it is important to become savvy so that you can occasionally pick out the person who actually really might cause harm, in which case returning the cat would not be appropriate. But those experience has shown so far, after 10 years of this, that type of kind of pathological person is fortunately few and far between. All right, another fear shelters have is that people, are going to complain to local officials because now they can't just use the shelter as their cat disposal facility. And the reality is that some of them will. They will call up. They for whatever reason, you may even be a private shelter, yet they consider this to be some type of taxpayer entitlement that you'll take whatever animals they want you to take, and you'll euthanize them rather than return them. So people will feel that way, some of them, and the best way to deal with this is to inform policymakers about what you're doing before you start the program. That's not to say unless you're in a contract that requires it, you're not necessarily asking for their permission, but you're giving them a heads up. You're saying, we're moving in this direction. This is why we're doing it. These are the results we expect to see. This is the data we're tracking. We expect that, John down the street, who's been bringing us stray cats for years and years, is not going to be happy when we tell him he can't anymore, or that we're going to fix them and put them back. And he's probably going to call you up and complain about it. And that way you've kind of inoculated yourself against this kind of pushback. Another fear is that cat owners won't get a chance to reclaim their pets, because typically in a return to field program, once a cat has been designated to go back outside, you want that cat cycled through the shelter as quickly as possible. And if possible, you want to get exemptions to stray holds and move the cat in and out as quick as you can. So you get benefits like healthier, less disease in the shelter, things like that. Well, the reality is that the national reclaim average for cats at shelters is only 2%. And there's a number of studies that show that the chance of a cat going back home is much higher if you put the cat back where he was found than if you wait for the owner to come into the shelter. And let's go, well, we'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. So what are some of the benefits that we're seeing with communities that have adopted this program? And obviously we're seeing lower euthanasia, like you saw in Jacksonville. That's kind of a given. Cats that were being euthanized are going out alive. We're also seeing that as resources, because euthanasia is a very resource demanding program in most communities. The cost could, if you're sending people out to trap cats, you've got the cost of the trapper and the fuel and the time. But even if you're not, if you're just accepting cats that are coming in, you still have staff time for processing the cat, for taking care of the cat during any stray hold period, for the food, the litter. You're having to pay for the euthanasia procedure, and you're having to pay for the disposal of the body. Typically, these costs range anywhere from $50 to $60 per cat in a more rural area to well over $100 in some of the more major urban areas. That's per cat. So once you're not euthanizing these cats, those resources can be reallocated into more life-saving programs, including Return-to-Field, but also TNR. Sometimes we see dog behavior classes. It doesn't necessarily have to go to cats. It can go to any type of life-saving program now that funds are freed up. We talked about a healthier shelter environment. So if you do it the way that we'll be talking about later, which is keeping the cats in a separate part of the shelter, moving them in and out quickly, you end up with a healthier, less crowded shelter when it comes to cats. And so you tend to have what the research has shown is there tends to be less disease being spread. Public support, well, again, I'm not talking about fair or unfair. I'm just talking about what we've experienced as a field. Shelters that adopt this program tend to see an increase in fundraising, an increase in people wanting to come to the shelter now that it's identified with a 90% live release rate instead of an 80% euthanasia rate. Now all of a sudden people are attracted to spending time there. It seems like a more happier place to be, less depressing. People, as we saw in those surveys, they prefer live outcomes, so they'll give their dollars towards that. Culture change is another big advantage. Again, potential advantage, both inside and outside the shelter. So I've talked about outside the shelter, how if you are committed to managing community cats through sterilization, then when you start to do return to field, you are leading the community. You're basically saying, this is the right way to deal with these cats. It's not to drop them off here and just not care what happens to them afterwards and make them disappear. It's to fix them. And if we fix enough of them and we do it in a high enough percentage of them in a given area quickly enough, we're going to see the population go down. Every cat we fix is one less potential nuisance in terms of howling, foul odor, things like that, fighting. So this is what we're doing, and we're walking the walk. And you'll find that the community will start to follow. And typically, when return to field programs start, TNR activity in the community also increases. Inside the shelter, you can see some very, very dramatic changes. I can give you a couple of examples that I've experienced. One was in Albuquerque, where the veterinary technician at the municipal shelter for years and years was responsible for euthanizing the unwanted cats. And when the return to field program started, she asked if she could come along for one of the returns to see the cat being released. And of course, the answer was yes. She came along, the cat was released, and she just burst into tears. I mean, she was so happy that these animals were now leaving alive, and that, she did not want to be killing them. And now she didn't have to anymore. And it was a tremendous psychological boost for her. Another example was in San Antonio, where I was working with PetSmart Charities and helping to administer a grant with Best Friends Animal Society to San Antonio Animal Services. And we were doing a program I'll talk a little bit more about later, where the cats were being returned to field, but then they were also being, there was follow-up TNR activity taking place. So the cats were brought back, and then the rest of the cats in the area were being fixed too. But San Antonio's 1.1 million people was too large even for a big grant. So we ended up dividing the city in half, and cats that came in from certain zip codes were eligible for return to field. The others were not, at least for the grant. So the ACOs, the animal control officers at the shelter, they were very uncomfortable with this after a while, because it felt very arbitrary to them that this cat came from the zip code, so she gets to live. This one came next door outside the target area, and that one would die. So what they did, the animal control officers on their own, they found grant money to get the cats outside the target area spayed and neutered, and then on their own time, they drove the cats back and released them. So you see this motivation. You see people becoming innovative and creative, because people don't go into animal welfare to see animals die. They go there to help them and to see them live and to see them have a better life. And now you're making that possible for animals who in the past had no chance. And it creates just a whole new atmosphere and a whole new culture. Also another thing that Return to Field does is it avoids the needless euthanasia of roaming pets. And let me talk about that point in a little more detail. So when we're talking about roaming pets, what do we know? We know that people let their cats roam outside more in warmer climates than maybe in colder ones. We know that most cats going out, and again, I'm not condoning any of this, this is just the reality of what we're dealing with. Most roaming pet cats are not microchipped and are not wearing any type of identification. We also know that indoor cats escape and get lost. And we know that cats who are pets, who are highly socialized, may be very frightened when they're brought to a shelter, and they may present as unadoptable. And we know, as I mentioned before, that return to owner rates for cats are at most shelters are very, very low. So how many of those frightened, seemingly feral, unadoptable cats that come into the shelter are actually somebody's pet that are being euthanized? So what we don't know is, that's what we don't know. We don't know how many of those strays are really pets. We don't know if we fix that cat, or even if the cat's already fixed, if we put the cat back where he or she was found, how many of them would find their own way home if they were released back. So this is the decision. So we don't have to, if we're returning healthy cats, cats who we believe are going to thrive back in their environment, then we can avoid what are undoubtedly some pet cats that are being put down now. Okay, so now we're going to get to the first town hall segment of our presentation today. And Stacy, I'm going to hand it over to you. And we're going to, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts. But at this point, what are your thoughts about this? What are your questions about the policy of it? About the, is this a good idea, a terrible idea? Why do you think? What's your experience? Let's, hear from you.
So folks, if you want to put your hand up, and what we'll do is we'll turn your microphone on, and you'll be actually able to share your comments live with us here. So if you have comments, you can put your hand up and we will check you out. And Kristen, if you can turn your mic on too, maybe help me through this. So I see Richard Richard. Let me turn on mute. Richard, did you have a comment?
Oh, I was just registering, but I do have a question.
Great.
What's the? I'm not clear about the difference between TNR and return to field.
Okay, so there are kind of two sides of the same coin, but basically in a TNR project, you are going out. The agency that's performing the project is purposefully going out to trap the cats in order to get them spayed and neutered and put them back. So they may or may not ever touch upon, they may or may not ever enter a shelter. Shelter is often not involved. The cats may be trapped, brought right to a spay neuter clinic, held, and then released back. But the purpose of the trapping is to get the cats fixed and put them back where they came from. With return to field, typically the purpose of the trapping is to remove the cat permanently from the environment and give the cat to the shelter and hope to never see the cat again. And then it's the shelter that makes the decision, not the trapper, to fix this cat and put the cat back. So with return to field, these cats are cycling through a shelter. The shelter's making the decisions. In a TNR project, it's the caretaker, the trapper, the community that's deciding, let's fix them and put them back.
Issa Martinez, are you out there? Issa, I turned your microphone on. Your hand is up. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just shout a little bit more.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, much better. Yes.
Thank you. I live in an urban neighborhood where dumping owned cats outside happens on a daily basis. And while I really love the concept of return to field, my concern is that implementing this in my neighborhood will just give people the misconception that it's okay to dump their owned pets, their pet cats outside. What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, in our view, each cat that comes to the shelter should be evaluated and assessed individually for what's the best available outcome. So if, you know, what we look for are clues that the cat was abandoned and is not a community cat. And there are all sorts of ways, depending on your experience, to tell that. So for example, if a cat, excuse me, if a cat is observed for a week staying frozen in one spot, as opposed to moving around the neighborhood and appearing regularly at mealtime, well, the frozen cat is probably an abandoned cat. Did the neighbors just move and leave their cats behind? You know, things like that. And if we see that a cat is not a community cat and most likely would not thrive outside, then we don't accept them into the program. And so the cats that are going back outside are cats that, from the information that we have available, we believe are going to do well. Also, you have to take into account what the circumstances at the shelter are. If it's the middle of the summer and they're really overcrowded and the cat's been seen in the neighborhood, friendly or not, for a few months and is doing quite well, then it's a better outcome for that cat to put the cat back. So in terms of people thinking like cats are coming back, you know, so therefore we can dump them outside. I mean, there's a myth with TNR too that, well, you know, if you're managing a colony of cats, people are going to just start dumping cats willy-nilly. I think my experience is that when the decision to abandon is independent of whether there are cats around, but the location of where to abandon isn't. So I suspect there are not that many people who are they may dump their cats in the spot where they think they're being fed, but if they were going to dump their cat, they were going to dump their cat. So, you know, I think that's a risk. It's a fear. It's something to keep an eye on. But I haven't seen any data yet that shows that that's, you know, actually occurred.
Issa, does that answer your question? And I can move on to the next person?
Yes, and so just a question about the data. Is there no data because RTF is relatively new, or because this hasn't occurred in areas where RTF has been an implemented program?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's new, and with so much that has to do with free roaming cats, data collection is very difficult. So a lot of what we know is just kind of what I call, tribal experience. What is the field seeing as a whole? What are shelters experiencing? Is anybody reporting something like this? So it's not to say that this isn't happening or won't happen. It's just not something that has come to the surface at this point.
Dana, you have your hand up, but you are also self-muted, so you have to unmute yourself if you would like to pose your question. I have unmuted you on my side, but Dana, if you're out there and you're listening and you can figure out how to unmute yourself, I have you unmuted. And oh, Kimberly's got her hand up. I know she knows how to unmute herself. Kimberly, let's go with you and see what your question is, and hopefully Dana will figure out how to unmute.
Okay, well, maybe this is not reasonable to ask 3 questions, but
That's okay.
Brian, I'll let you pick what you want to answer. One question is naming these programs. When I was
let me go one at a time because.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh.
Austin called it the SCRAP program, and people freaked out. They had to change the name to even begin to get any acceptance. And this is including people who ran Lost Cat Facebook pages.
Well, here's the thing is, yeah, you want to be very careful with the name and like a name like Scrap, even if it's a clever acronym, kind of implies that, the cats are trash or things like that. So that would be kind of have a negative connotation. What you want to do, I think, is avoid esoteric terms or more not esoteric, but industry terms. So return to field, like we all know what that means, but the public has no idea. We talk about community cats. Well, they just see stray cats. So, you want a name that I think connotes a positive image. Could be healthier cats, healthy community, whatever. I'm not good at names, but it should be something that's can be marketed as a positive outcome for the cats and for the community in terms that people understand.
I think what I was asking is if you've heard of any programs that did have a good name, some examples for RTF programs.
Oh, that's an excellent question, and not off the top of my head, but that's a good question. I'll have to look into that. But again, I healthy cats, healthy community, I know is one. It's a little
vague.
Yeah, but that's okay.
Better than Scrap.
But yeah, I'll have to look into that. I don't have any good examples off the top of my head. Sorry.
Kim, I'll let you choose one of your last 2 questions because we'll get moving along here. But you get to choose one more question for Brian.
Okay, I remember a number. I know about the 2% RTO, but at somewhere I remember reading a number that returning the cat to field triples. This is assuming it's a pet cat, triples the chance of the cat getting back home. Or it may have been even higher than that. Do you remember that number?
Well, it's research that I believe was done by Dr. Kate Hurley at the University of California, Davis. I don't recall the exact number, but it was something like, it was much more than triple. It was, you have 2% return to owner at the shelter. I think it was more like 20-30% that it was like about 30% because I remember it was like 14 times higher if the cat was placed back where the cat was found.
Okay, I love using that statistic, but I don't know. I'll ask Dr. Hurley what it was. Thank you, Brian.
Sure.
All right, one last question. Corey, are you out there?
Yes.
Corey?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Do you have a question for Brian?
I do. I'm wondering if there's any data to show sort of the financial side of comparing the cost of the euthanasia track that you described earlier against the cost of the process of spay and neuter, and also, you know, sort of having the cat there for a day or whatever that looks like. Any way to compare to show, you know, actually it is more cost effective? Because my question was, oh, well, it does cost to have the TNR done as well. So is there a comparison between the two?
The comparison is so kind of specific to the community that the best thing to do is to look within the community that you're dealing with and draw that comparison. So most shelters are able to give you a number for the euthanasia. If they can't, they really should figure it out since it's such a basic part of their operations. But most of the time they can come up with a per cat cost. And then the RTF side is it depends on how, you know, are you involving volunteers? Like a lot of programs use volunteers to drive the cats back to where they came from. The two programs that I'm involved with both do that. And who's doing the surgery? If there's a in-shelter clinic, that's going to be probably a much lower cost than if you're driving the cats out. So what's the length of stay? Is it overnight, or do you have to hold the cat for 5 days because of a stray hold? So basically there is no one comparison to make, but within a given community, it's not too hard to come up with those numbers and make that comparison.
Okay, great. Some people are putting questions in the question box too. So there's just one pertinent question. I think you've covered most of the topics, but one person asked the question, just how do you know if a community is offering an RTF program? This person's asking specifically if you knew if New York City is starting to implement anything, but I think a good question is just, you know, how do you find out if there is really one in place?
Well, yes and yes. So in New York City, Neighborhood Cats runs in working with the animal care centers. We run a You Can Go Home Again program, where we transfer cats out of the city shelters and then return them. So there is a Return-to-Field program in New York City. And but in general, talk to your shelter. They'd be the first ones to let you know. Call them up and ask them, you know, what do you do when when somebody, you know, brings in a cat, doesn't want them around, but the cat's healthy and thriving and feral. What's the outcome for that cat? And if they're doing a Return-to-Field program, they'll, you know, they're not going to be hiding that. They'll probably be proud to tell you they are.
Great. All right, we'll let you continue, and then we'll do more questions later.
Okay, great. So next we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of how to do this, but I thought we'd actually start at the end. And just to give you a sense of, I mean, this all seems very abstract. So here's a little bit of just a couple of minutes of Susie and I and our experience with the outcome of Return-to-Field.
Okay, buddy, you're home. You excited? Here you go. Kitty, you home? Gotta go.
So when we talk about how to actually do return to field, this is the flow and the topics that we'll cover. So first we have the cats being intaked, and we're gathering information about the animal and his or her circumstances. We're talking about return to field with what we call the finders. The finder is the term for the person who brings the cat to the shelter. We need to assess the eligibility of the cat for return to field. We have to decide where we're going to house the animals and track them. Then there's the veterinary intervention, the actual return, and then what do we do post-return. So we'll go through each of these sections. So intake is really a crucial moment, because this is the moment where your best chance to gather information about the cat's circumstances and history. And this is what is going to form the basis for your decision about whether the cat should be part of this program. And you may or may not be able to call the person who brought the cat in later and pick up things that were missed, but you may not. This may be your only chance. So intake is really critical. So the things that, and if you go to have a look at the Return-to-Field Handbook at animalsheltering.org, and you'll find intake forms and sample questionnaires and things like that that you can build upon. But these are the real critical areas that you want information on. Number one is the location of origin. So where did they find the cat? That obviously is crucial. One of the things you have to be aware of is that the finder's home address, what appears on their driver's license, for example, may be different from where the cat was trapped. It's also a very good idea when you're given a trapping location to immediately check it online on Google Maps and make sure that that address is correct and that it exists, and that there's no confusion about that, because you can't return the cat if you don't know where the cat came from, obviously. So make sure you have a correct address, check it on the map. Just a trick about Google Maps. If you, what it does is you enter an address and then it drops a pin where that address is located. Well, if the address doesn't exist, it doesn't say to you, address doesn't exist. It puts the pin like in the middle of an intersection where it thinks the address might be, or it puts it in the middle of an empty field. So if you see the pin on the map, not next to a building or a workplace or a residence, but it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere, you have to look a little further and make sure you have a correct address, or ask the person for a landmark or what intersection or something else besides that. You also want to get the cat's history. So how long has the cat been observed in the area? So that's a big tell on whether a cat is a community cat. If they've been in the area for months and they come in and they're healthy, that's a pretty strong indication that that's their home and that they're doing well there. If they've only been seen for a day, well, then it's a lot iffier about whether this was a dumped cat or whether the cat's around, and you have to look at other clues. Is the cat ill? What is the behavior of the cat? So I mentioned before how cats that are lost or recently abandoned will be frozen in place as opposed to moving freely about. Is the cat, how did they capture the cat? Were they able to just pick the cat up and put the cat in a carrier, or did they have to trap the cat? All these kinds of things will give you a clue about whether the cat belongs outside. And then what were the cat's circumstances? Is a feeder known? Are there other cats in the area? Is there construction nearby that might pose a danger? And then also ask, directly, why are you bringing the cat in? And like I said, you'll be surprised. There'll be all sorts of reasons. And often what may happen is once that the finder's reason for bringing the cat in may be solved by fixing the cat. And they may be, you may end up converting that cat from what we would call, a return to field outcome to a TNR outcome, where the finder may even be willing to come back and pick the cat up, because the problem they were having really had to do with the fact that they were reproducing and the situation was getting out of control. Also, you want to note, what's the finder's attitude? Are they hostile, or are they friendly, and to what degree? Are you dealing with an extreme case which you feel may pose a real threat to the cat? Keep in mind that sometimes people get angry if you decide to talk to finders about the fact that return to field may happen. People may get angry about that, but people who actually articulate threats are very rarely going to carry them out. The scarier people are the ones who are like really angry and silent, and those are the ones you have to worry about more. But basically, you can see a lot of this is a judgment call, and the more information you have, the better your judgment's going to be. So we raised that question. So this is a policy decision to make, and also it's one that can change over time. So how are you going to start out is really what you need to decide. Are you going to inform people bringing cats in that the cat may be fixed and returned, or are you not going to do that? What I've found is that most programs seem to evolve towards, they just come right out and tell the people, this is, you may be seeing the cat back in your neighborhood, like it or not, and having an open discussion about that. Because again, the angry finder is a stereotype, which means that there are some people like that, but an awful lot of people are not. You can put the return to field possible outcome in your surrender forms. So basically, it's right there, and people are, when they sign the form, are acknowledging, whether they read it or not, that the cat may come back. You want to, one advantage to really having a conversation with people is to see if they'll agree to having the cat come back, and all of a sudden the cat becomes a TNR because it's going back through the finder, and not because the shelter is bringing the cat back despite the finder's wishes. And then you want to talk about complaint mitigation. So often these cats are being brought in because people are feeding birds in the backyard, or they're worried about there's cat poop in the garden, and they want to let their dog in the back, whatever it might be. And there are all sorts of deterrents when you're not talking about a large area of land, like motion activated sprinklers or ultrasonic devices, fencing, that can keep cats out of areas. So it's good to have that conversation that may take care of the problem right there. Okay, assessing eligibility. You need to decide who is going to make the decision about whether the cat is eligible for return to field program. Is it going to be your admissions staff at the moment of intake? Are you going to have specially assigned staff, like a community cat coordinator who maybe admissions refers cases to this person, and then they review all the information and make a decision? Or you might have a team approach where you have somebody from veterinary, somebody from community cat, somebody from adoptions, whatever, get together and they go over the cats and decide what the best available outcomes are. Obviously, the team approach has the advantage of a lot of input. You might get a better result, but obviously it's going to take a lot longer. Admissions, if it's decided right then and there, that has the advantage of speeding up the process, getting the cat into the return to field program and through the cycle faster. But you may end up with inconsistent decisions depending on what different admissions people believe or how they assess things. In general, I think what my experience is the programs that work best are when admissions people flag the cats as possibilities. And then there's one staff person who's experienced with community cats who then reviews the cases and makes the final call. So next we're talking about, when we're talking about assessing eligibility, we want to consider the cat, him or herself. So are we looking at a healthy cat? That's usually, if the cat's been seen in the area for a while, that's a pretty good indication that, like, as I've said, that they're doing well in the area. Does the cat have any disabilities? Like, is the cat declawed or blind or whatever it might be that wouldn't, make it inadvisable for this cat to be living outdoors? Temperament is a factor. If a cat is feral, then there probably are not a lot of alternative outcomes. You may have some barn placements or working cat programs, but usually those can't handle the volume of feral cats coming in. If they can in your community, that's great. Although sometimes, even if you do have those programs, if a feral cat is doing quite well where they came from, going back there may be the best thing. Age, are we talking about a 2-year-old adult or a 2-month-old kitten? It's a good idea to have a cutoff and not to be putting very young kittens back outside unless they're welcomed back for both optical reasons and also the well-being of the animals. But on the other hand, if you've got hundreds of cats in your foster care system and you don't know what to do and you think the kittens have a reasonable chance back where they came from as opposed to no chance in the youth room, you may decide to put them back. And then, as we mentioned before, what was the cat's behavior? How do they act? Sometimes cats don't do well in shelters, but they may be perfectly friendly in other environments. So what about those friendly cats? And this is one of the big issues that we have in the Return-to-Field program community right now among programs that are doing this, which is, what do you do when the cat is obviously friendly and social? And as I mentioned in the very beginning, community cats can range in socialization from feral to, a lap cat. So some, communities feel like no friendly cats should ever be put back outside. And others go to the opposite extreme and feel like every cat that came from outside, unless it's clear that this cat was abandoned or lost, should go back outside, regardless of whether they're friendly or not. Personally, at Neighborhood Cats, we kind of go for more of a middle course. And we try to look at all the different factors and decide on what's the best available outcome at the moment that you have to make this decision. So when a friendly cat comes in, so a cat you're pretty confident, is adoptable, what's the shelter's capacity for care? Are you going to go beyond your capacity if you accept this cat into your you try to find this cat a home? Do you already have more cats or as many cats as you can take care of? What is the cat's history? Sometimes there are these friendly cats living outside who are real neighborhood cats who people want in the community, who have very strong ties and can do quite well. Sometimes they have no histories and nobody's ever seen them before and they just showed up one day crying. So those are two very different situations. So you want to make an individual assessment for that particular cat. So like this kitty here, I think is a really good example because we're actually trying to figure out what to do with him now. He's not a return-to-field cat, but he showed up in a colony that we help care for here on Maui. But, and he definitely, we know that he's a lost cat because he was seen, unfortunately, the person who had this information didn't keep the owner's original number, but the family was evacuating from a brush fire and the cat got out of the car, ended up in our colony. Now we can't find the owner. So, but the problem is, it's not a good time for friendly cats because things are very crowded right now. So essentially, we're feeling like at this moment, his best outcome is just to stay in our colony where he's cared for and he seems to be doing okay. So, which is just to say that there are situations in which friendly cats are better off outside. And there are definitely situations when they're not. So friendliness, in our view, is not a make or break. It's not a black or white thing. It's one factor to consider with all the other ones, what's the best available outcome. All right, you also want to, when assessing eligibility, consider where the cat came from. If they're about to knock the whole block down, and there's going to be a lot of demolition going on, then that's probably not a very good place to put the cat. We talked repeatedly about, does the finder pose a risk, or are there other people in the neighborhood who might pose a risk? We find that is quite a rare situation, but you still have to be alert for it. Excuse me. Are there any known pending changes? So, for example, sometimes people bring community cats in that who they've been feeding, and they say, well, I'm about to move, and nobody in the area is going to feed them. So then you have to ask yourself, look at the neighborhood on a Google map. Is it likely there are, because often these cats are fed at multiple sources and everybody thinks they're the only ones feeding them. Is it likely that they have other food sources, that they can find other food sources? Have they only known this feeder since they were little kittens, and that really will, and it's a kind of environment where it's unlikely anyone else is going to provide food, things like that. What's the risk to wildlife? We don't believe in returning cats back into bird sanctuaries or places where they pose a risk, into land that's specifically managed to protect the wildlife from risks like cats. So that's something to think about. What's the likelihood the cat is owned, that this is somebody's pet cat who is out wandering? Did they have a collar? Like we recently had a case of a kitty cat was brought in, and the kitty cat had a collar with a tag, a printed tag on that said, I'm not lost. I like to go out for walks. Just leave me alone. Unfortunately, they didn't put the owner's phone number on it. But in the end, the assessment was made that, yeah, this is somebody's cat. So let him go back home. And what are there caretakers or neighbors who are waiting for the cat to come back and want the cat to come back? Okay, so once you've decided a cat is eligible, then you have to decide where you're going to keep the kitty. And this is an example of the holding space at the Maui Humane Society. Used to be an overnight drop-off kennel that got converted into a community cat room, which is great. And what's the point to make about this space is it's separate from the rest of it's not, these cats are not mixing with the general cat population, and they're not near the dog kennels either. You want it to be warm, dry, and secure. Obviously, in a climate like Hawaii, you can have kind of outdoor open air spaces like this one. In the Northeast, you couldn't do that. You want the space to be convenient if there's an on-campus clinic, so that the cats don't have to be carried up the stairs or too far around the buildings, but just across the parking lot would be fine, or pick up, drop off if they need to be transported elsewhere. So in this space, we can just walk out the door and boom, we're in the driveway. Keeping track of the cats, that's something you also have to figure out. So what they do at Maui Humane Society is they have one of these plastic sleeves. They zip tie it onto the front of the trap. We'll talk about using traps to house the cats. And you can see this, they have a picture, they have the cat's ID number, and as the cat goes through the system, all the information about the cat is recorded onto this sheet, including where the cat came from, all the veterinary care. And you can see on the lower right there, it tracks whether the cat's approved for release post-surgery. Once the cat's released, somebody signs, the surgery's been, an outcome have been entered, the whole thing. So this is just a sample form, but basically this form follows the cat. I would say one of the most crucial parts of this form is the photo, and having that photo in color. So that obviously not a lot of help when you've got 3 black cats, but even then, sometimes you can tell differences in face structure or size, things like that. But having the photos in color, and then you're going to look at that photo before that cat is released and make sure you're dealing with the right animal. So you can see, let me go back. Here, the cats are being housed in traps and kept up on tables. So that's one way to do it. That's very space efficient. You can deal with a lot of animals at once. If the cats are going to be held for a length of time, or if you just have this is your preference, you can keep the cats in normal cages if you have feral cat dens inside. So that kitty's inside a feral cat den. You can see on the right there's a porthole door. So that door can be opened and closed without opening the cage doors. So it makes it a lot safer when you're cleaning. You can just, because the feral cats especially tend to spend their time inside the dens. So you can use a stick, close the porthole door, take the den out, and then clean the cage. And the length of stay, the length of your stray hold may impact whether you keep the cats in cages or keep them in traps. Although they can be kept in traps, we found for, up to a week, and they're fine. So here's caring for cats in traps. We recommend traps that are a minimum of 30 inches in length and have sliding rear doors. You use trap dividers, which are those 2 brown pitchfork looking things. So you segment the cat off on one end, and then you can open the other and put fresh newspaper in, put food and water in, keep it clean. There's a video on neighborhoodcats.org.
Log the cats as they come in, identifying both their trap number and the colony they came from. It's especially important to do this if you're trapping multiple colonies at the same time. The traps become cages which the cats never leave prior to release, except during the spay-neuter surgery. To set the trap up as a cage, start at the front door. Get the cat to move to the opposite end by pulling back the sheet. Ferals tend to move from light to dark. Insert 2 trap dividers back to back from above. You should always use 2 because the occasional cat is strong enough to push his way through 1. Open the door and place newspaper on the floor. Always remove any dirty newspaper and waste before putting fresh newspaper in. Shut the front door, remove the dividers, and cover up the front end of the trap again with the sheet. Go to the rear door and again pull back the sheet. Then insert the dividers. Open the door and place newspaper inside. Then put in food and water. The water should be in a low, flat container to help prevent it from getting knocked over. Close the rear door, double checking to make sure the latches are secure. Then remove the dividers and cover the back of the trap with the sheet. This method of feeding and cleaning should be done twice a day to minimize smell and to keep the cats as comfortable as possible. Sometimes the light to dark trick doesn't work and the cat won't move. Try tapping the side of the trap lightly and shooing the cat. If that doesn't work, you might need to use one of the trap dividers to give them a little push. Contrary to many people's first reaction, it's fine to keep cats in traps for several days. Feral cats actually prefer tight, dark spaces over something like a large open cage, and they adapt quickly.
But like I say, we have that video on our website. If you go to how to TNR, then trapping, you'll see a page that says caring for cats and traps. Just go there and you'll be able to see this in action. But it's a very efficient way. You also want to keep the trap covered with a sheet at all times, especially if the cats are feral, because that keeps them calm. For those of you who are thinking like, oh God, how can you keep a cat in a trap, you know, for like 5 days or something like that? With feral cats, they actually prefer to be in tight, dark spaces if they're confined. So that's why when you put a feral cat in a large cage, you have to provide something like a den or a cardboard box or a carrier, because that's where they want to be. They're going to spend almost all their time inside that smaller space. They feel protected and they feel safe inside there. So actually in a larger trap, they tend to have more room that they use, as opposed to inside a cage where they'll, you know, probably if you've been in a shelter with feral cats and they put newspaper in the cage, you'll see the cat spends all her time underneath the newspaper. So it's not inhumane at all. We've been doing it for 20 years. And if the cat was going to stay for more than a week, well then, yeah, then you want to, you know, give them a little more room, that because they might use it, they might not, but you know, but for a week or so, you're fine. So the surgery is obviously the key, the spay neuter. You can ask yourself, are you allowed, if you are subject to a stray hold, can you perform the surgery during the stray hold and at least save that amount of time of having to hold on to the cat? When you're preparing for the surgery, remember timeliness, getting these cats in and out as quickly as possible. Your ideal thing is the cat comes in on Wednesday, the surgery is performed on Thursday, the cat is back outside on Friday. That would be your ideal scenario. So the faster you can make it move, the better. You have to decide who's going to do the surgery, obviously. Are you going to have to do off-site transport? Then you also have to deal with the other things involved with off-site, which would be, you know, scheduling, communicating with the clinic, and making sure that payment is done in a timely manner. As far as the actual veterinary care, spay neuter, obviously, ear tip, where required, rabies vaccine. Optional would be the FVRCP vaccine, the flea, any kind of flea, ear mite, worm medications, especially if the cats are infested in some way. Most clinics don't have the luxury of doing dentals. If you are able to, that's probably the one time the cat's going to get a shot at that. And of course, any superficial injuries or illnesses that you might be able to treat with a convenient shot or cleaning out an abscess or something like that. If you're able to do it, that's great. So we mentioned stray holds a couple of times and how they can impact a RTF program. And I just want to, you know, if you are subject to a stray hold that's like 5 days or something like that, there is hope. This is a state law in Arizona where actually it exempts cats going into return-to-field programs from stray holds. And just so this, normally these cats had to be held for 72 hours, but if they're part of an RTF program, that 3-day period is waived. So it is possible, if your laws are making RTF longer and more difficult, to have those laws changed. And using the law in Arizona as a both an example that this has been done and what some good language is, you can use this. So the return, you have to decide who's going to do it. Is it going to be your staff at the shelter? Or are you going to use ACOs? Are you going to have volunteers? Maybe you have a partner group. So this is the part of the process where volunteers and partner rescue groups can be really super helpful. because the returns often require knowledge of the area, flexible schedules. It's great if you've got people who are experienced with handling community cats and know what to look for when, and are just a little street savvy. And it just lowers the costs of the program if it's not being done by staff and ACOs. So if that's sometimes it's easier legally for the shelter to transfer the cats to another group and then have that group responsible for doing the actual release. So it might be a legal problem for the shelter to do it because of contracts or county laws that have to do specifically with that type of agency, but not a problem at all for a local nonprofit to do it. Before you actually go out the door with the cat, we recommend you go through this pre-return checklist. Make sure there's medical approval that somebody, a veterinarian or a veterinary technician has looked over the cat and said, yes, the cat looks good, ready to go. Confirm that the cat does not have any type of collar. Often this mistake happens when a cat was maybe sent over to adoptions, but kind of flunked and then got put back in the Return-to-Field program. Sometimes people forget to remove the collar. Some shelters put a collar on every cat that comes in. So make sure there's no collar on the cat before you take them out the door. Remember, cats, if there is room, if your cat is taking friendlies in for adoption, if there's room for that. Sometimes we've mentioned these cats present as feral when they first arrive, but they calm down after a few days. And sometimes we've seen cats who were rejected from adoptions, who 3 days later are lying on their back and kneading in the air. So we always kind of alert the intake staff or the adoption staff that this is the case so that they have a chance to reevaluate whether they want to keep the cat. The address check is real important. You don't want to get out there and then discover that the address doesn't exist. So again, we recommend you use Google Maps. And this photo behind on the slide is actually a satellite image from Google Maps. And you can see that red pin next to 1552 South Kihei Road. So we would enter that address, that pin would pop up. And now you can, without going on site, you can actually scout the site. So let's say we're going to release a cat at 1552 South Kihei where that red pin is. Well, you can see that South Kihei Road is a pretty busy road, right? So we'd be afraid if we let the cat go right in front there, because you can't go onto private property. You have to, release the cat on a public spot. Well, what if the cat turns around and tries to run across this busy road? So what we would do, especially if this is an adult cat who has, a range of at least a couple of blocks, we would go 1 block over to, it looks like North Alaniu Place, that next block over to the left. And opposite the pin, the house opposite the pin where you see it says Hawaiian Weddings, that's where we would let the cat go. Because the cat's going to know the whole neighborhood. Now there's no risk of the cat running into a busy street. So you can do this kind of scouting before you head out. Now also make sure that the trap is locked, or if you're transporting in dens, that the den is secure and also locked if it has a lock. Okay, once you're there, these are things you have to think about. How discreet do you want to be? If there's a note on the return sheet that, hey, this person was really unhappy about this cat coming back, then maybe you want to do it on the next block over or a few houses down. Most times programs evolve to a point where they're very open and transparent about returns. In the beginning, though, often there's a desire not to kind of launch quietly, not to draw a lot of controversy in the beginning or to risk that. And so then you might go at quieter times of day or release the cats at night, things like that. If it's really bad weather, you probably want to wait a day or two. Depending on the age of the cat is how close you need to be to the location found. So if you're dealing with young kittens, you need to be very close like right at the location. If you're dealing with adults, you can be a block or two further away. Also, if there's a caretaker involved, was this person contacted and do they want to be present at the time of the release? Public versus private property. You know, when you're dealing with certain public property is always fine, you know, on a sidewalk, in a park, in a green area, you know, places that are public property, you have every right to just let the cat go. You don't want to step onto somebody's private residence. Where you get into kind of a gray area, or like maybe shopping malls behind the stores, or inside a very large condo complex. And then you have to really examine your local laws and have a policy, and you know, it becomes more of a judgment call in these kind of quasi-public places. But the general rule is release the cats on public property whenever possible. Again, kittens need to be released right at the spot where they were found. Dealing with confrontation, you know, we've done hundreds of releases ourselves and have had, I think, maybe one, maybe two, what I would consider hostile encounters. So it's pretty rare, but you want to think it out ahead of time, and you want to have some materials that you can hand to people that explain what you're doing. If people are open to discussing it, that's great. It's an opportunity for outreach. It's an opportunity to educate and to get more acceptance. If you're dealing with somebody who just doesn't want to talk about it, who's only being angry, then you want to say, if you want more information, call the shelter and just walk away and go. Don't get into a pointless argument. That doesn't help anybody. And the worst thing you could do is escalate a situation. So try to deal with people calmly. If they're not willing to do that in return, then leave the scene. Okay, so post return to TNR, and of course the notion is where there's one community cat, there's often going to be many others. As you can see in this situation, there were. And let's talk about what to do afterwards, and the role of return to field in an overall community cat program, not just return to field alone. So if the cat you're returning to field is the only cat in the neighborhood and it looks like this, that's great. Everything's under control, you know, and the situation will be better. Kitty won't be, you know, yowling in the middle of the night or spraying noxious odors to mark his territory, and things will calm down quite a bit. However, if Kitty was part of a colony and now you've returned this one kitty, but there are 9 others who share the same territory, you're not going to get any population control with this return to field alone. And that's a myth that still floats out in some places that really needs to be dispelled. Return to field is not a population control program for this reason alone, because if you don't get a high enough percentage of the cats fixed in a given location, the cats who are unfixed are going to reproduce more than enough to compensate for the one cat that was fixed. So you may get a little bit of nuisance abatement. Certainly you've assisted that cat's life. Certainly it's a value judgment, you know, that we agree with, that this cat being alive is a lot better than this cat being dead. But when it comes to, you know, if you hear these things about, well, we returned to field 2,000 cats in San Jose and our intake dropped and that shows that the population went down, that's not true. You're not targeting, you're not fixing enough cats, you're not getting high enough sterilization rates with just return to field alone. So when you look at return to field and the community as a whole, this is what it looks like. So you've got these colonies of cats and you've got 1, maybe 2, because, you know, that's part of the problem with euthanasia as a way of dealing with community cats, is that these individual trappers, you know, they have 1 trap, they have 2 traps, these private citizens, and they bring in 1 cat and 3 months later they bring in another cat. And, you know, they don't trap enough cats fast enough to impact the population. And it just becomes this endless cycle of euthanizing cats for no discernible gain. And this is why. And return to field alone emulates that. You're fixing one cat, you're fixing two cats, but you're not getting enough of them. So if you do what has been referred to as the red flag approach, meaning the RTF kitty is a sign that there are probably other community cats in the area, and then you do follow-up trapping at the location of release, then you're going to get population control at that area. So now it's not just the return to field cats that's fixed, but trappers were sent to that location, they got the other 9 cats, and now everybody's fixed, and you really have your best shot at the numbers going down over time and not having more and more cats brought in from that location. When you look at it on a community level, that's what it looks like. The red cats, the red circles are the return to field cats, and the blue cats are the targeted TNR follow-ups. So this is also where a shelter that has a return to field program, if they partner with a TNR group, a TNR nonprofit, or individuals who really are passionate about this, it can be a great combination, because you're not just saving that RTF cat's life, you're also addressing why the cat came in the first place potentially, and avoiding having more cats coming in. You can also do community level targeting as another strategy for combining TNR with return to field. So in this case, what you would do is, instead of targeting each individual colony where the cats, RTF cats, come from, you would identify a high need area of your community, which in this case would be zip code number 3, and you would do all your TNR there. And this would more directly go to the sources of intake and have more of an impact on lowering your intake. Also, it minimizes the vacuum effect, because you've got less migration if the colonies are all fixed in the same area. So essentially you would be saying, we're not trying to do population control in zip code 1, 2, and 4. We're just going to do RTF, but in zip code number 3, we're going to do RTF and targeting that entire area. These are programs that were administered in partnership with Best Friends Animal League and the local shelters. And this is exactly what they did. They did return to field, and they followed it up with targeted TNR. They used both that red flag approach of trap follow-up at colonies, and they used targeting high need sections of the community, depending on what stage they were at. And we're talking Albuquerque, San Antonio, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Tucson, and Columbus, Georgia. And you can see on the left there, the highlight in yellow, these were the average results. Feline intake went down by 32%, kittens by 40%, euthanasia down by 83%. So you can see they had pretty dramatic results once they integrated return to field and trap neuter return together. So that's why I encourage communities and shelters to, you may start off with return to field. That's often a great place to start, because you relieve the pressure in your shelter. But once that's done and you start to look outwards, you want to combine return to field with targeted TNR to actually start to address where these RTF cats are coming from in the first place. And you start to get these kinds of dramatic results. And just to highlight Albuquerque, here you can see in 2010 as the baseline year, they were bringing in close to 10,000 cats and euthanizing at least half of them. 2011, they started a return to field program, but all they did was return to field. There was no follow-up at that stage. And you could see that euthanasia, the red bar, went down by about the number of RTF cats, the green bar, but intake didn't change. It actually went up a little bit. But in 2012, they started to combine return to field with the TNR. And now you see not only euthanasia keeps dropping, but you see intake steadily dropped afterwards. So if you want to lower your euthanasia rate and your intake rate, it kind of behooves you to move towards a program that combines the two, return to field and targeted TNR. Okay, about targeting, I just want to alert you all that I will be on the online cat conference hosted by the Community Cats podcast is coming up on January 24th to 26th. It's a great virtual conference. There's a lot of wonderful speakers. You can pop in and out and listen to who you want to or the whole thing. You can get early bird tickets for $50 up until November 30th. And I will be speaking on targeting specifically in much more detail than I did today on Saturday, January 25th. I believe it's at 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. It's my slot. But check it out. Go to communitycatspodcast.com and you'll see there's just a lot of really excellent workshops and speakers. Also wanted to let you know if you've missed our past webinars in the Neighborhood Cats Community Cats podcast series. They are recorded and available. You've got trapping tips and tricks, the drop trap, a trapper's best friend, and also colony caretaking tips and tricks. And those are the URLs for the YouTube recordings. And there's a lot of other webinars too on Community Cats Podcast, which you can get by going to the website and clicking on resources and then the public webinar archive. Okay, so we're down to more of our next town hall, as I like to call them, and you know, questions and thoughts, and now we hand it over to you guys.
Sounds great. Brian, this is great information. It's absolutely fantastic. So Kim, you talked about different in the questions box, you were talking about Kim has to enter all this info when she's dealing with the lost and found cats. Date of evacuation, need address found, any claw cues, shredding, worn pads, grease, oil, date, location, and claw clues. Those were some things that Kim threw out as her categories.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's getting pretty detailed. I also see a question from Kimberly in the chat about the percentage of cats coming into shelters that are intact and microchipped. Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm not sure in general, but I think it's a fairly low percentage of most of these, the vast majority of these cats coming in are not fixed. Actually, some of them are ear tipped, but very few of them are I would say it's less than 10% of the cats coming in are already fixed. At least in my experience.
Great. Samantha, are you out there? I just turned your microphone on. Whoop. Samantha, can you talk again? Let's see if we can hear you.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Are most of the time when great. Our city is trying to pass into its ordinances a community cat program that includes both RTF and TNR, which neither are recognized now as options for community cats. Are they generally packaged together that way? Because we seem to be getting a lot of pushback on the RTF side. Does it ever make any sense to separate one from the other? Obviously, TNR is without, I mean, RTF cannot go without TNR as far as a population control, as you mentioned.
Well, I would say that, I mean, that becomes like more of a political and a legislative strategy about, you know, what can you get through? So if you can only get TNR through, that does tend to be less controversial. But I have seen, but that's kind of a case-by-case call. I mean, in general, we see evolutions in all sorts of directions. So sometimes we see shelters just starting off with return to field because, especially if they're in a high euthanasia rate environment, and they just want that to stop and they want to free up those resources. And then they start to look out into the community and do TNR. In New York City, it kind of had the opposite evolution where TNR was really well established, and then return to field kind of evolved, you know, years later. So there is no right or wrong. I mean, the thing that I would avoid is, you know, kind of having TNR legalized and then RTF illegalized. So you'd want to keep the RTF at least neutral so that it could evolve more into the future. But ideally, you want to do both, you know, because they, like I say, they're two sides of the same coin.
I agree. Thank you.
Kim, you're out there. You have anything to follow up on those couple of questions that were out there from you? Are you there, Kimberly? Kim?
Yeah, I'm good. I think Brian answered it. I was wondering about intact numbers that come in and microchipped, rough idea of how many, but I think he answered that. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Good. I think that covers most of the questions out here, unless somebody else, you've got just a minute or two before we close out with a little trivia. Anything last? Anybody seeing anything out there? Susie covering the, oh, here's some questions in the question box here. Question is, how can a nonprofit group partner to do return-to-field targeted TNR at the shelter's RTF address, and are there grants in particular for return-to-field? This is Anne's question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, it's a little bit vague. So it says, my question is, how can a nonprofit group partner to do return-to-field targeted TNR at a shelter's return-to-field addresses? So I'm not sure.
Oh.
So I guess it's maybe
okay.
using a shelter and sort of collaborate. How do you collaborate, I guess? And then she's wondering if there are any grants to help support these programs.
Well, one way you can do it is once the cat has been returned, you can leaflet, you know, do door hangers, things like that, kind of cover that neighborhood and talk to people on the street. Just try to gather more information about, are there cats there? Try to find out who's feeding them. Like I say, put door hangers, asking people to call you if they were seeing or feeding cats, and first get that information. Then you can go about starting to arrange trapping them. As far as grants go, well, I would recommend, you know, join the Best Friends network. They have small grants for this kind of stuff. Sometimes Maddie's fund does these $5,000 innovation grants, and they have allowed done some funding of RTF and targeting. I'm not sure if Petco Foundation is doing grants right now. Also, don't forget to look at local community foundations. I know Neighborhood Cats, we raise a lot of money from these small family foundations that will give you grants for, you know, $2,500, $5,000, $10,000. So look there too, not just the large national groups.
Excellent. So before we jump into trivia, and I think unfortunately,